awesome. There's never been a barbecue like this before.
Moments like these put
some of the most memorable moments on Earth aren't even happening on Earth. The Emirates A380. Hello, tomorrow.
This program is brought to you by Santos. We have the energy.
Set aside.
The fish decided it had had enough.
It actually said, "You want a piece of me?"
I'd like to turn on Sky and listen to you, knowledgeably commentating.
100 homes have been decimated.
And the storm of a generation has had a major impact.
The storm goes on.
And I want to thank the President personally. They can call me personally at the White House.
Delivering unrivaled live coverage. This is Sky News, Australia's news channel.
Hello, welcome to The Nation. I'm Ashley Gillen. The final weeks of the political year are often known as the political killing season. It's often seen as a good time just before Christmas to dump an unpopular leader and replace them with someone fresh and new. All year we've heard from Julia Gillard's supporters that if she lasts until Christmas, she'll also last all the way until the next election, with tonight being the final night of the second last sitting week of the year. You'd have to say that the odds are now in the Prime Minister's favour. In fact, after a stellar news poll result for Labor, the Prime Minister's position is looking more solid than ever this week. The latest poll suggests that if an election was held this week, well, the Coalition and Labor would emerge neck and neck, both on a 50% two-party preferred basis. Julia Gillard came out as the preferred Prime Minister over Tony Abbott, while the opposition leader's approval rating is remaining stubbornly low. So what do these numbers mean for both sides of politics, and where do we sit at the end of this parliamentary year in terms of the political landscape? Joining me on our panel this evening, the former New South Wales Labor Minister, John Della Bosca. Good evening. Peter Bentley, the head of the Labor-aligned McKell Institute, the head of Willard Consulting and former Liberal staffer, David Miles, and Peter Debnam, who's the former New South Wales Liberal leader. Good evening to you all, and thanks for joining us. John Della Bosca, let's start with you. Is it too early to say Julia Gillard is safe, and how important for Labor's morale this week was that news poll?
Well, one of the things that I think I believe is very credible out of that news poll is the evidence that Julia Gillard is more and more successfully using incumbency, or her incumbency as a Prime Minister, to establish a good platform for her as opposed to Mr Abbott. So winning the preferred Prime Ministership in a poll is important, and there's a bit of a trend line there over a considerable period of time now across all the polls. I'm afraid I would love to believe the news poll result in terms of the 50-50 two-party preferred result. I simply don't believe it. I can't say why I think it's wrong. I can say why I think it's wrong, which is there's no sense or feeling that that's where we are. It doesn't agree with any of the other respected polls. And I think, as I said, though I'd like to believe it's true, I think the figure is the Labor is still considerably behind in two-party preferred terms, mainly because the Greens are collapsing. And the news poll automatically distributes now a vote that no longer exists, being a Greens vote that's disappearing, evidence being Canberra, Sydney, the local government elections in New South Wales and so on. So I think there is an issue there, but I think the good part of that for the Labor Party is that there are good things about Julia Gillard, very evident through that poll, but not necessarily good things about Labor's prospects for election at the moment.
Peter Bentley, is this perhaps a once-off? Is it too early for Labor to be getting excited about these numbers?
I think it's too early to get excited, but I think the story of the polls is actually the story of the carbon tax. And when we look up until July this year, Labor was doing very poorly, and there's no doubt about that. And Tony Abbott was essentially telling the electorate that, you know, the world was going to collapse and the economy would fall apart from July 1. And people listened to that. You know, there's no refuting that. The government said no, it wouldn't, and just trust us. And up until July 1, the majority of people didn't trust the government. But from July 1, we've seen a consistent trend of support moving back to the government and moving back to Julia Gillard. And it is, to use the term Julia Gillard uses, the lived experience of the carbon tax, as every week rolls by and people realise they're not losing their job, You know, the roast isn't going up the way they were told it would. The electricity bills, while they may be going up, aren't going up by the proportions that they were told they would. They're starting to realign back to the government and starting to say, well, maybe the government was right, maybe it isn't that bad. So, obviously, I agree with John. I don't think if an election were held today, the government would be, very comfortable or confident of victory. But the trend is there, and if it continues, and if we don't see, frankly, a bit of a changing strategy from the opposition, then I think there's good reason and good evidence to illustrate that we'll continue to see that trend for the rest of this year and into the new year.
Peter Debnam, I saw you nodding along there. Do you agree with that analysis that this is a lot to do with the carbon tax?
Yeah, I certainly agree with the carbon tax because, as we've discussed a number of times before, the way the government handled that was just appalling, just terrible. And once you got past 1st of July and most of Australia saw that the world wasn't coming to an end, then clearly the impact was going to drop off. But as John said, he'd like to believe the news poll, but it's perhaps not an indicator of the federal election. It's an indicator of sentiment every fortnight. And I think, Julia Gillard is probably safe because parties tend to look at news polls and make their decisions about getting rid of leaders on news polls. What they should look at is the betting, as we were discussing before. And Labor's still on a hiding to nothing for the federal election. And presumably those polls will change as we get closer to the election.
David Miles, is the carbon tax really behind this, or could it have more to do with the vitriolic debate we've seen in recent weeks, especially when it comes to the claims of misogyny back and forth across the parliament?
Yeah, look, I mean, I'm not sure what impact that really has out in the electorate. Most people don't care. Most people...
It made a lot of people sit up and pay attention.
Oh, well, within a certain sector, but, the vast majority of people, frankly, in the seats that count, are more concerned about how they're going to pay their bills and are they going to keep their job. They're the issues that count. And one of the things about national polls is they're obviously a national poll, but this election is going to be won or lost in half a dozen seats. If you look at the US right now, no one's looking at national polls in the US. They're looking at what do the polls say in all the swing states because they're the only ones that count. So on news poll, I'd agree with John. I mean, one of the things about the latest news poll, I mean, there's certainly no real trend there when you go from 50-50 5 weeks ago to 53-47 and then back to 50-50. That's not a trend, it's a seesaw.
But it's a trend from 6 months ago.
Well, no, but it's not really. If you look at the poll, if you look at the polls, everything for the last 18 months pretty much has stayed within the margin of error of 55-45. It's barely moved outside. In fact, other than these two news polls, it hasn't moved outside the margin of error of 3.5% from 55-45 for a year and a half. So it's within that margin of error. And the other thing about this is that the Greens vote was stable in this news poll. Well, that just beggars belief. 8.5% swing against the Greens in Sydney City Council, 5% swing against them in Canberra. They went from 4 members to 1. It just beggars belief that that's the case. And can I say one more thing about the 50-50 poll? That would imply that the Australian public are happy to go for another round of a hung parliament.
I think
that's just crazy. And everyone knows there is not a snowflake's chance in hell that we're going to have a hung parliament again, in which case any poll that's turning up 50-50 is just wrong.
Peter Debnam, what did this poll mean, if anything, for Tony Abbott? We keep seeing his own approval rating very low. Labor has been enjoying this week. Some have been gloating a bit more than I thought they might have at this early stage.
I think you can already see a change in what Tony's doing in the last week. And clearly most political parties have warning of what's going to be in the news poll because you're doing your own polling. And I think if you look at Tony in the last 10 days, you can see him slightly trying to change the way he's presenting himself.
In what way?
Well, to be less negative, less attacking, and I think he's softened his approach quite a bit in the last 10 days. So I think that's good because we all know, the job of opposition is to attack. But where you actually had an election, the last election, where it ended up a level playing field, well, the opposition has to actually present a good platform and actually be positive, and you can't be negative every day. And I think Tony's starting to change, but if I can just go back to one of the comments David made, the last comment about the poll, and John said as well, the poll's wrong. The poll is today's sentiment, of the community. And as Peter said, I mean, a lot of people are relieved that the carbon tax hasn't dramatically changed their life. And Julia Gillard in the last few weeks has taken control of the parliament on a couple of occasions, and I think she's done well in the parliament. So, and people like that. But it's probably not going to change their vote at the election. whenever the election is.
Yeah, I think it's an all-male panel here tonight, Ashley, that you're managing, but it was a bit dangerous to get into this territory. But I think just going back to the slapdown speech, as it was called, and I was in the camp of many people, and I suppose many men, that this wouldn't really necessarily play all that well in the electorate. And I think I was wrong, because what happened was that people interpreted this as the act of a leader, that Julia Gillard looked like she was in control and in charge, slapping someone down when they were being cheeky and out of line, and that was the way they processed it. Forget about the arguments about misogyny and sexism. They might be important to some people, but the really important aim was that she was positioning herself as a leader. And I think that that's really the other little story of this poll and how it fits into the overall political situation, which is that if you look at the two strategies, and you say Tony Abbott's now changing his strategy, and I think you're probably right, Julia Gillard has always had a long game. She had from the time she did the deal to establish her government, she's based her strategy on a 3-year government, and the carbon tax, everything else that she's doing fits into that strategy. Tony Abbott has always been playing a short game. He's always been taking the idea that he could knock the government off balance and use the issues that he knocked them off balance with as the electoral device to bash them over the head, i.e. the carbon tax and other things. But now that's receding. So the game has changed very dramatically in Julia Gillard's favour. How long it will stay in her favour is another question.
I think it is interesting to note that a few weeks on from that speech from Julia Gillard, we are still talking about that speech. We're not so much talking about the numbers on the floor of the Parliament and the whole Peter Slippers saga. Everyone's moved on from that. But that speech is still getting a lot of focus.
But I suppose it's actually that speech, but it's actually not really the content of the speech. As John said, you know, a lot of people reacted to the content of the speech, but I really think it was the way she delivered it. That was the point. And a lot of Australians looked at it and thought, great, she's actually, for the first time, or one of the few times, she's actually looking like a Prime Minister in control of the Parliament. And she hasn't really looked like that since she was Education Minister. She was really good in education and then totally lost it as Prime Minister.
Here's the thing, political parties always talk about cut-through and trying to you know, get a message to cut through. I have not in the last 3 years seen my friends on Twitter and Facebook that are completely disengaged from politics tweet and retweet and post on Facebook and talk about a political issue like they did with that speech, you know, and we saw exactly to that point. It went viral internationally. Now, there's over 1 million people internationally that looked at that speech. They didn't care about Tony Abbott. They didn't care about Peter Slipper. They were looking at a strong leader, and I think she got that cut through.
None of those people voted.
No, but those in Australia do. So.
But it didn't have anywhere near the coverage that you know, around the world of Australia, and I think people look at it in context. And yeah, it was a strong speech, but I don't buy into the claim of the impact that it has that, you know, people are talking about, because it hasn't shifted poll numbers. In fact, I saw some research.
Her favourability have gone up.
But favourability hasn't changed the two-party preferred. It doesn't really matter.
It has again from
people don't vote on who they favour most. They vote on a party, and that's how we vote in this country. We vote on it. You know, it's a two-party preferred is the only numbers that count, and so it's really not particularly relevant. Maybe she showed some strength, but you know, a lot of feigned indignance as well. So,
but politics over it, as you know, politics is about character, and if people watched that speech and made a positive assessment about the PM's character based on it, then that is bankable and there's potential there. Now, I'm not going to go out on a limb and say it definitely is the case, because I don't think it's too early to make that assessment. But as Ashley said, we're talking about it 3 weeks later. If we're still talking about it in 6 months' time...
Well, we are here, but I don't know anyone else is still
David,
talking about it.
I want to bring you back to the point of Tony Abbott. We have seen in Canberra this week a few coalition MPs raising their eyebrows at this news poll. Labor's had a lot of fun with it in Parliament this week, of course, when it comes to Mr Abbott's own ratings and suggestions that his leadership could be the one that is under threat. He's often labelled as the most successful opposition leader we've seen of our time. But do you think that Peter Debnam's right and that he needs to change tack, and we're starting to see him do that?
Well, I think that any time, you know, any political party has a strategy that goes from the time of the previous election until the next election. You're at a period of time now where we're getting towards the end of a year, we're going into an election year, and naturally you're going to see the strategy move towards preparing for an election year, which is going to be policy rollouts and, and a more positive agenda about this is what I'm going to do. But the reality is, from opposition, you have to crush the government before you get the airwaves in order to promote your agenda. That's what happens. The government, as the incumbents, that is the benefit of incumbency. You get first say on pretty much every issue because you're the government. So a role of an opposition, first and foremost, is to destroy the government's agenda and point out what's wrong with it. And once you have established that and made it clear and the public accepts that the government's going the wrong way, then you have the opportunity to go and put out your agenda, and you'll see that, I think, coming into the new year.
John Della Bosco, we saw an interesting intervention from Kevin Rudd earlier this week. On the day the news poll came out, he did one of those wonderful doorstop interviews through Canberra Airport, and he called on his caucus colleagues to be honest about the events that led to his knifing. It came, of course, off the back of Maxine McHugh's book and excerpts being printed in the press last weekend. Is Kevin Rudd, was he just reminding everyone, do you think, that he's still there on that day? And do you think that he's still biding his time, or has he given up?
I'm not sure. I mean, it's hard to know whether he's biding his time, as you put it. Actually, I suppose I would be surprised if Kevin Rudd still didn't have a view that he might be Prime Minister again sometime. Whether how soon that is, I don't know. It's a matter for debate. But look, I think there's no evidence of an ongoing campaign. There are clearly people that are Kevin Rudd supporters that are close to Kevin in the caucus. They remain so. Some of them are in the cabinet, some of them are in quite senior positions in the cabinet, but they're working for the good of the government. And look, I think there is some still residual personal ill feeling about the way the leadership change occurred, but not certainly with Kevin himself, but with quite a lot of his supporters. But I don't think that is surprisingly, I don't think that's the fundamentals of division yet, because Julia Gillard is doing so. I almost made you the leader. Julia Gillard is doing very well, doing well in the polls and doing well compared to Tony Abbott. If that changed, then it's possible that this all could start again.
Peter Debenham, do you think we're getting a bit of voter fatigue when it comes to these memoirs and discussions about Kevin Rudd, but also the books, Maxine McHugh, we heard from Lindsay Tanner just a couple of months ago. Are people sick of hearing about Kevin Rudd's knifing?
Well, I certainly think, I mean, all these political books that come out disappear in a couple of days. The Australian public takes no notice whatsoever of them. It's sort of the inner circle in Canberra and Sydney. And I don't think the average Joe in the street has any knowledge of them at all. In terms of fatigue, I think the Australian public do get fatigued with politics. The vast bulk of them just turn off it and, they ignore it, and then we force them to vote every 4 or 3 years. And they focus especially in the last few weeks or last few days. But, when you look at all these news polls and everything, you really should look at the betting as to what people are actually thinking. And that is that the Labor's use-by date is up. It's as simple as that. But the polls will go up and down, but I think Australians have made up their mind.
Well, I think Essential Media this week was 54-46, wasn't it? I mean, and they've been pretty consistent throughout and aren't really jumping around. And 54-46 is terrible numbers for Julia Gillard. I mean, that shows that all the things that people talk about, because there's been a couple of completely inconsistent polls within Newspoll that are very easy to, frankly, dismiss, people are trying to interpret that as being some positive thing and saying, I've just heard Julia Gillard's doing well in the polls. She's not doing well in the polls. She's doing terribly in the polls. Labor's primary vote is still in the toilet. And, this is just the reality. I mean, keeping in mind Howard won in '96 with, 52% of the vote and got a 48-seat majority.
Tends to depend on which one you're reading at the time. There's only one that matters, as the politicians tell us on a daily basis.
But the other reality going into this election, though, is that, this is an election where, in order to retain power, Labor has to win seats off the coalition. Because it can't just maintain what it's got and win. Because the independent seats, at least 2 of them, Lyne and New England, are likely to switch straight back to the coalition to take them to 74. It won't take much. Slipper will go, so there's another one, there's 75. I can't imagine Dobell staying in Labor hands. There's 76. And Wooshka, there's the election. So unless someone can find me which of those seats Labor is going to win instead, this is a nonsensical argument to say that Julia Gillard's doing well.
For us to analyse between now and the next election. After the break, we are going to move on and look at some policy issues, including, is the Treasurer really going to deliver that budget surplus? Do stay with us.
too entrenched views. Real estate website, huh? He wants a new home. But she has some plans to renovate. Either way, I'm thinking they don't have a lot of spare time to get their loan, right?
Whether you're refinancing, renovating or buying, ANZ Home Loan Specialists can help make it real.
My money's on the renovation.
With CFDs, I can trade on the rise and fall of indices, shares, forex and commodities.
It's important I can pursue 24-hour trading opportunities and still control my risk.
I use CFDs when I want to trade the markets without putting up the full value of my position.
That's why I trade CFDs with IG, the global CFD specialist, creating opportunity since 1974.
The world sees Australia as a lucky country, blessed by nature. But today, our greatest natural resource is our thinking. At home and around the globe, Australian ingenuity is achieving extraordinary things. And we're creating partnerships to help keep Australian thinking and skills in demand the world over. Because today is for the clever Australian.
Every aisle you go down, you'll find a trusted brand and they're at the lowest prices.
Arlec Halogen Worklight, only $29.88. Matador Hooded Barbecue, $599. Irwin Jack Handsaw, just $8.94. Lowest prices are just the beginning.
Whether you're refinancing, renovating or buying, talk to ANZ, Australia's Home Lender of the Year. Whatever your plans, we can help make them real.
The damage is still being assessed, but it's in its billions. Have the insurance companies been cleaned up? Will America's perfect storm make our premiums in Australia rise? We asked one of Australia's best-placed insurance chief executives to get his crystal ball out on the world's weather and the financial fallout.
It won't be the same.
The answers will surprise you. Plus, the man in charge of $46 billion of Australian super, Ian Silk, on the outlook for the global and Australian economy. All on the next Australian Business.
Yeah, roll starts are tricky. You got it in second? You got to put it in second, right? Now make sure you drop the clutch.
That's right. With 550 newton metres of torque, the Nissan Navara is still Australia's most powerful tradie.
Welcome back to The Nation. We saw in Question Time this week the opposition move on from earlier in the week focusing on the broken promise over the carbon tax to later in the week changing tack, focusing on what it believes is going to be another broken promise when it comes to Wayne Swan's budget surplus. On The Nation with me tonight, John Delabosca, Peter Bentley, David Miles and Peter Debenham. Thank you for joining us. John Delabosca, how bad a look for the government's reputation when it comes to economic management would it be if Wayne Swan doesn't deliver on the surplus?
Well, one, I don't think it has a lot of consequences for economic management. That's one of the ironies of this argument. And both political parties and a lot of commentators have got themselves locked into the idea that the only way you can prove your credibility is to have, your forward estimates at some point returning at a surplus. Now, I think the best way to respond to your question is that it will take a lot of explanation, simply because Wayne Swan, the Prime Minister, Penny Wong have over and over again emphasised this undertaking to enter back into a surplus. But there's very good reasons why they need not have a surplus, and it's still very responsible. Get there with the argument or get there with the budget? They won't. My own view is they won't, but they might. I don't know. It's I'm not privy to Treasury's briefings, so I wouldn't really be in the best position to judge. But whatever happens is they need a very credible way to explain to the public why they don't, and why it doesn't matter as much as it did when people were continuing to reinforce the promises. And I think that's going to be the hard thing to do.
When it comes to budget surpluses, David Miles, should we expect governments to move with the times as circumstances change, as we have seen the economic forecasts change over this past year? Should we expect governments to go with the flow? And when do you think we got to this point where a budget surplus suddenly was the mecca for economic management?
Well, I think we had a period of government in the Howard years where they delivered 9 successive budget surpluses and got the nation into a very good state, paid off every piece of debt that existed, put $70 billion into a future fund, and, you know, it's taken less than 5 years to see that all disappear. From $70 billion of, you know, net profitability, we've gone to $150 billion of net debt and the 4 biggest deficits we've ever had, despite the fact that the government's income has continued to grow. And this is what I think is often missed in this debate, that everyone wants to talk about percentages of GDP, but GDP has exploded in the last 5 years. And the government's income receipts in the last 5 years has increased by 35%. The problem is its spending has increased by 45%. So it keeps spending more every year, but it's had more money than anyone's ever had before. And this year alone, the government will spend $100 billion more this year than the Howard government spent in its last year in office. And that was only 5 years ago. $100 billion. Where has it all gone?
One thing you didn't mention, though, in that answer, David, is the global financial crisis. Peter, do you think...
a little blip on the economic...
Let's be honest about that.
I think it is. And I think... I completely agree with John's point that if they don't get to a surplus, they have to explain it very well. But budget forecasts are very difficult. If anyone wants evidence of that, just go and ask the New South Wales government. You know, yesterday there was $1 billion turnaround between a deficit they predicted and then a surplus. These are difficult things. And I think we as a community... David, I think we as a community actually need to give our politicians a little bit of leeway to actually be a little bit honest about circumstances. And you know, there are a whole range of factors that no politician, no government, no matter what their political stripes, can control. You know, global financial crisis, terms of trade, commodity prices, these are revenues side factors that they can't control. And then there's expenditure side factors, you know, the Queensland floods, you know, the asylum seeker rebuilding of islands, of detention centres on islands now. So there are a whole range of different factors that governments do not have control over. And the question becomes, do we want a government to rigidly stick to a surplus and impose European-style austerity, you know, slashing Medicare, slashing higher education, or do we want them to maybe not get there and explain to us why they haven't got there?
To be fair, some economists are now saying, well, for the economy at the moment, now isn't actually the time to go and even pursue this surplus at the moment. But Peter Devlin, when it comes to that election campaign, you can see the ads when we've got this issue of trust, broken promises with the Prime Minister. You can see the Liberal adverts rolling out in front of us.
Absolutely. Actually, and the debate over surplus and deficit has been there forever. And the reality is, for the average person in the street, the only way they know whether the government's actually living within their means or not is whether the budget's in surplus or deficit. And I mean, that's the story in the street. And that's why the Labor Party is trying so hard to get back to it. I happen to think it's a very good thing. I think this argument saying, you know, run your deficits when you have to and whatever, fine. But when you can get back to a surplus, do it, because there's no other incentive to manage the public sector other than that. There's no profit motive there. And that's why I think the man in the street puts a lot of emphasis on it, and that's why the government is trying so hard.
And on New South Wales, Peter, can you believe that your former colleagues have missed $1 billion?
Well, I can believe the public sector gets it so wrong. And I thought it was extraordinary that the Auditor-General went through so many incidents where there were mistakes in there. But that does happen. And that's why you need a lot of pressure on the public sector. And surplus is one of them, but scrutiny is the other. And I think the Auditor-General's been doing a very good job.
And scrutiny from the opposition as well.
To be fair to the New South Wales Treasury and indeed the New South Wales Government, the problem there is that what we're focusing on is numbers that are around data entry, numbers that are around the structure of the budget. What we should be focusing on is what the budget's paying for and what it's not. And I think that's where governments have failed in communicating this debate about surpluses and deficits. It's what the value of the public sector dollar is paying for. I'd say that one other thing about in response to Peter's point is, there's a few private sector budgets that have been way out too. Sometimes to the best interest.
But at least they've got the profit motive there every month to actually make sure they're doing the right thing. Well, that doesn't exist.
Well, the federal government is actually now forcing an inquiry into how Treasury got their forecasting so wrong, because this is one of the issues. When the government talks about how much revenue it lost because of the GFC, it didn't lose revenue because of the GFC. It lost $9 billion is all it lost. But what it did in 08-09, it massively increased the forecast for income. Massively increased it. And then the following year when it didn't happen, well, of course, they downgraded it. But if I tell you next year I'm going to earn $3 million and instead I only earn $100,000, I can't turn around and say I lost $2.9 million. No, I just got my numbers wrong. And that's what happened. They had a forecast, they massively boosted it and then had to drop it again. Well, they should never have put it up that far in the first place. Government's now recognised that and said, we want to know why that was so wrong.
What the government is dealing with at the moment is the drop in commodity prices, of course, which is being felt right across the nation. We've seen these reports that no revenue was raised out of the mining tax in the first quarter. Treasury expects that there will be $2 billion to be raised in this financial year. But this is embarrassing, isn't it, Peter Bentley, when we see the opposition going on the attack in question time, as it has this week, making this point that the forecasts, which we only got an update of in MyEFO just last week or so, seem to be so out already.
Well, I think it makes 2 points. It makes the point that we've made here that forecasts are often fraught and they can be subject to human error and, incompetence and everything else. But I think it's unfortunate. Of course, we'd rather see, that $2 billion in federal coffers. But going to the point of the tax, the point was always made that this was a tax for good times when mining companies were making super profits, and we'd take a bit of that and put that into federal funds and redistribute it. Because of the dropping commodity prices, they're not experiencing the good times they were, and so they're not being attacked now. And I think there's been also the counter-argument which the government's been making that, Tony Abbott said this was going to destroy the mining industry and they're not paying any tax now. Equally, stands firm as well as the opposition's argument against it.
Some of it's offset against state royalties, so the states are getting money and the federal government's not getting it because they still have not sorted out that issue. They've brought in this tax without actually sorting out the issues relating to the tax because of the offset against the state rents. But, the public sees through some of this, though. I mean, the fact that MyEFO came out 2 days before the reporting on the mining tax, and MyEFO was, funnily enough, about a month early. Why was that? Because they didn't want to print MyEFO showing no revenue. And it was a blatant fraud. It was a deliberate deception to try and hide the fact that they had got no money from this mining tax. And what kind of a tax doesn't get any revenue? And to bring out MyEFO early to show an even thinner paper-thin surplus when you're going to lose $2 billion, which would have shown a deficit.
What MyEFO is.
No, but what they do know is the government comes out and does a lot of media talking about we're going to deliver a surplus, and 2 days later, oh no, we didn't get any money for this tax. But we printed it that we would.
But it's a one-day story. I mean, it just disappeared.
Was this an example of the opposition overreaching, though, Peter, when it came to the mining tax is going to ruin the industry, the carbon tax?
Oh, yeah, but I think, but as David said, I mean, the job of opposition is to really hold the government to account and keep the pressure on everything. But you do have to be careful that you don't actually push it too far, because eventually it might turn out okay. And then, Tony's got to explain it as much as the government's got to explain when circumstances change. But I think the opposition has to keep the pressure on. But my view has always been the opposition has got to have a clear philosophical position. They've got to have a real point of difference that they pursue all the time. And it won't necessarily be on the front page of the newspaper all the time, but it should be there all the time, everybody be aware of it. I'm not sure they've done that.
John Del Bosco, do you think that the Federal Treasurer maybe underestimated this idea of stockpiling the state royalty credits, as we've seen in reports that the big mining companies are essentially stockpiling them to avoid paying this tax at this point?
Well, I mean, obviously that's what's happened. I'm not sure if it's the Treasurer personally or the Treasury have done
that. Was always going to be a big issue with this tax, wasn't it? I mean, the history of federation will tell you if there's a possibility for states to arbitrage some money that would otherwise be going to the Commonwealth, they will do it. And we knew that in the private sector, in the mining sector at least, the feeling about the tax was so negative that they would probably, in some cases, do anything they could to make the tax less effective or ineffective, if I could put it that way. So, look, that was always a possibility. It's happened. You can't change what's happened. Wayne Swan, I think, needs to take at least part of what was said before very seriously, which is this royalty issue has to be sorted out. It's much harder now because in the key states, the premiers are all members of the Liberal Party and they're going to be negotiating a tougher position, I would have thought. And also, historically, been the case for a generation and a half now, the states are all cash-strapped. And so, whether they're Labor or Liberal, if they have a chance to get some more revenue, they'll take it. That segues perfectly into our next topic, which is the pokies reform. We saw the government had a win last night when the Greens said they would get on board for the government's very much watered-down reforms when you compare it to the sort of approach it was going to take when it was dealing with Andrew Wilkie. We're going to see now that there'll be a trial in the ACT of the mandatory pre-commitment. We'll see $250 withdrawal limits from ATMs on gambling venue sites, and also all new machines are now going to be fitted with this pre-commitment technology, but not necessarily turned on at this point. How significant is this, Peter Debnam? We all acknowledge that this is a watered-down policy from the initial plan, but in terms of even having the federal government now at the head of the table, when it comes to an issue that's been so heavily dominated by the states, how much of a precedent does that set?
Well, I think it's very important, but I think it's important in two regards. One is the federal government's got their foot in the door on reform of this area, but I think it's also very important in that the Greens have made a strategic decision that they actually better get on board something and stop frustrating everything. And I think they probably remember the asylum seeker debate, that they came out of that very poorly. With people dying at sea and them sort of standing on one side just saying, we'll be purer than everybody. So I think it's important to see the Greens actually swapping, but I think it's also important to see the federal government's got their foot in the door. And my view is there's so many areas of state control where nothing's going to happen. The states are just going to continue with grassroots politics. And it is up to the federal government to actually step in and say, well, look, we're a little bit above the grassroots politics and we think this certain reform would be better. Julia Gillard did it in education. She was very successful. Maybe she can do something in gambling. But I personally, I'm not one who's really all worked up over gambling. Australians gamble. It's a fact of life.
The Greens, when you look at what this deal was, the Greens have been pushing for a maximum of $1 bets. The government was never going to go for that at this point. What they won in return to striking this deal with the government is $1.5 million to be spent on a new gambling research institute. That's what got the Greens over the line. Andrew Wilkie, the Greens, they're all pretty much saying, Peter, well, this is better than nothing. Is that really something to hold up and be proud of for a government that had gone in saying it was going to be so tough in this area?
Well, I don't think anyone could argue that the process hasn't been messy up to this point in time.
That's an understatement.
Having said that, I also think Andrew Wilkie and Nick Xenophon, for that matter, won't be happy unless an axe is putting every poker machine in the country. And I don't think, personally, I agree with Peter, I don't think that's a good public policy outcome. And I think while we all acknowledge action needs to be taken to stop problem gambling and support problem gamblers, we shouldn't be throwing the baby out with the bathwater. We shouldn't be destroying clubs throughout Australia, and we shouldn't be stopping punters having a bit of a flutter while we're trying to implement good public policy. And so what I like about this is it is incremental. There are a few significant moves, reducing the ATM withdrawals, as you say, preparing the machines for mandatory pre-commitment if a government at a later date decides to push the button. But the good thing about it is it's not going to destroy the club industry, it's not going to destroy pubs and clubs, it's not going to send small businesses to the wall. And if at a later date we say, this hasn't been as effective in supporting problem gamblers, then we can ratchet it up a bit more.
And the Productivity Commission, though, really didn't say that this would send clubs to the wall. It was saying this wasn't about some people just having a flutter, this is about problem gamblers. And the initial recommendations were going to be things to address those problem gamblers in particular, but it ended up, John Delabosco, just getting too hard in terms of some of these marginal seats. I'm thinking of Mike Kelly, for example. There are a number of Labor MPs really up in arms about this.
Well, this whole question of pubs and clubs and their kind of role in communities on one hand, as I suppose the buttress of a lot of people's community support, but also, you know, the sort of corporate intervention of, you know, clubs, associations and Australian Hotels Associations, all those sorts of things have been canvassed for a long time, and they've had an influence on poker machine policy at a state level. The Commonwealth, if they have a role, it is around this harm minimisation question. And, you know, they shouldn't be taking a view, as Peter said, on gambling, whether gambling is moral or immoral. That's another argument for another forum. The issue is, if there's problem gamblers, what possible steps can the Commonwealth make to improve that? And this package is pretty good from that point of view. It's a long way short of what Andrew Wilkie and Xenophon wanted. But, you know, it's interesting that they've taken the pragmatic view for once, which everybody else has had to cop for the last 2 years, which is that it's a hung parliament. You take what you can, do the best you can out of it.
Well, with the Greens on board, the government doesn't need the coalition now, but this is one of those areas the government often holds up, David, as saying Tony Abbott is so negative, he can't even support gambling reforms.
Yeah, but, you know, this again, this feigned moral superiority coming from the government is just ridiculous. This is a government. Well, can we be honest about this? This is a government that promised the world on pokies when it desperately needed Wilkie's vote. It desperately needed Wilkie's vote. So we basically promised him whatever he wanted on pokies, no problem. You know, we'll do all of that. We'll get your vote on the floor of the House. Yeah. Then they did a deal. Put the devil in the big chair in Peter Slipper and, you know, completely shafted Wilkie. Said, well, everything's off now because we don't need your vote anymore, so, you know, you can go away. Oh, and funnily enough, Peter Slipper's no longer the Speaker. He's back on the floor of the House. Oh, quick, pokies is back on the agenda again because all of a sudden Wilkie becomes important again. I mean, this is cynicism, you know, a cynical government wrapping itself in a cloak of moral superiority. Give me a break. It is only back on the agenda to try and protect their numbers on the floor of the House. I mean, you said before that Julia Gillard plays the long game. Give me a break. This is short-term politics all day, every day and twice on Sundays.
We will give you a break. We're going to a break now. Plenty more coming up in a few minutes. Stay with us.
Yes, punters, welcome to the world of Sporting Bet.
At Sporting Bet, we live and breathe sports and racing. It's what we do, day in and day out. That's why we're the punters' favourite, providing top odds and unique promotions on a huge range of markets. And our cutting-edge technology means you can bet anywhere, anytime. So if you're into sports and racing as much as we are, go to sportingbet.com.au today, because there's no better bet than a sporting bet.
What do we have here? 2 entrenched views. Real estate website, huh? He wants a new home. She has some plans to renovate. Either way, I'm thinking they don't have a lot of spare time to get their loan, right?
Whether you're refinancing, renovating or buying, ANZ Home Loan Specialists can help make it real.
My money's on the renovation.
The world sees Australia as a lucky country, blessed by nature. But today, our greatest natural resource is our thinking. At home and around the globe, Australian ingenuity is achieving extraordinary things. And we're creating partnerships to help keep Australian thinking and skills in demand the world over. Because today is for the clever Australian.
Maintaining optimal health has never been so easy. From Nature's Own, Australia's #1 omega-3 brand, comes Omega Platinum. It cuts through the omega confusion with a powerful combination of fish and krill oils that make it the only capsule with a 1-a-day dose for the combined benefits of joints, heart and brain. So try Omega Platinum for your optimal health. Nature's Own. What does your body want?
At Sportingbet, we live and breathe sports and racing. So this spring carnival, we're giving you Maxitive Gold on all Group 1s, where you get 5% bonus for every length your horse wins by. Just another reason why there's no better bet than a Sportingbet.
1 Million Women is about empowering women to take practical action on climate change.
1 Million Women really is an opportunity for me to make a difference. It's about a band of women getting together and initiating change.
It brings together women from all backgrounds.
Women are very, very powerful people in driving the lives of their family and their society.
I think we need to act because we owe it to our kids.
So join me and thousands of other women as we get together for our biggest event ever.
This program is brought to you by Santos. We have the energy.
Welcome back. We saw another backflip from Federal Labor this week. It came from the Immigration Minister, Chris Bowen, who announced the government is going to be pushing to excise the Australian mainland from the migration zone. It's a bid to further deter asylum seekers from getting on those leaky boats and effectively blocks onshore processing of all asylum seeker refugee claims. John Della Bosca, this must have been a hard one for a lot of Labor people to swallow. Chris Bowen himself describing it tragic, illogical and a stain on the national character just a few years ago when John Howard tried to do the same thing.
Probably the difference between Chris's position and my position is that I still think those things about it. I don't think it's a... Look, I've got a lot of issues with this problem that both parties have had of being unable to distinguish between public policy commitments around border protection and the legitimate defence of Australian borders and the refugee and the refugee obligations we have. Now, you know, this is the latest measure in a new consensus, and I suppose we all should be happy about there being national consensus. It just happens to be a consensus I don't agree with, Ash, so I'm probably not the best person to ask. You should probably ask me.
David Miles, let me ask you, obviously this is an issue that the Liberal Party dealt with some years ago. We've seen, though, that in that time the Houston panel has recommended this change. So the government's been able to wave that piece of paper and say, well, look, you know, this is what we accepted when we accepted all of those recommendations. Is that a fair enough argument?
No, it makes a government policy now, because what the Houston report said was that what the government had been doing was completely wrong. And basically what had been done before was right. It worked, they changed it, they messed it up, and now they're having to reverse it. It's about time the government admitted it got it completely wrong and put in the full suite of measures that worked before, rather than this piecemeal approach of adding one every couple of months.
I think we're about there, aren't we, David?
Well, we haven't got temporary protection visas back yet.
Oh, yeah.
You know, so there are a couple of other measures that are yet to be done.
Turn around the boats.
Turn around the boats where it's safe to do so. You know, all of these things are a full suite of measures. But you know, this is more than just a backflip. You know, there's a few turns and pikes in there. This was a vitriolic debate in 2006, and the comments that came out of leading Labor figures, including Simon Cream, Tony Burke, and a whole bunch of others about this policy in 2006, to have the government now do it, I mean, it is just incredible that they can even stand there and do it and try and pretend it's somebody else's idea, as far as the Houston report, and they're just implementing it. I mean, this is a government that got it wrong, and we're now at a position where this year alone we've had more people arrive by boat than in the entire 11 and a half years of the Howard government.
But is it time for them to do some more backflips and take on some of the coalition's policies here, especially when it comes to TPVs?
Well, here's the thing. Obviously they've changed position, but we need to look at the motivation of why have they changed. And Chris Bowen's changed the position, and yes, it's embarrassing, and yes, I'm sure he doesn't enjoy having the opposition or you or any of us read his prior comments back to him. But the reason he's changed it is because Angus Houston made the recommendation that if you excise all of the other islands and people land on those islands and are processed offshore, but don't excise Australia, then you provide an incentive for people to come to the mainland in order to be processed here. Now, that's an incentive that they'll risk their lives in leaky boats and could die. If we flip this, just for a second, in an alternate reality and think, well, if the government instead said, you know what, Mr Houston, you've made this recommendation, you've put us on notice that people could die if we don't excise the mainland, but you know what, we'll came out pretty vehemently against it in 2006. We don't want egg on our face. We don't want our quotes being read back to us. So, you know what? We're not going to take your recommendation. And we saw boats make that perilous journey and we saw people die. Then that would be an outrageous state of affairs, and people would be right to be outraged at the government and say that they had played politics and they had put politics before people. They haven't done that. They've done the opposite. And so I think they've actually put people before politics. They're copping a hiding on the way through, but it's the right policy decision.
Where is the evidence that people are trying to get to the mainland?
I think in political pragmatic terms, they have also neutralised a potential area of criticism or substantially gone very close to neutralising it. So
Peter Debnam actually has an interesting angle on this, because most of our viewers probably don't know his former life was in the Navy, and so it brings you a specific view on this, especially when it comes to that coalition policy of turning around the boats.
Yes, it's not real. And I think, and just to that perfect point, but I think the important point is that just in terms of excising the mainland, I mean, they're just ticking the boxes in the Houston report. They've got to do that. They commissioned it. But my view is you've got to look at the Malaysian option. I mean, that's the only disincentive. You've got to say to people, you get on a boat, well, you won't end up in Australia, full stop. You'll be treated as a refugee, you'll processed, but you won't end up in Australia.
But even the Houston panel did say there's a way to go on that policy.
Oh, absolutely. I think there's a way to go.
The Malaysia policy had a cap of 800 people.
Doesn't matter, David.
That was over in 2 days.
It's a concept. It's the only concept.
No, but it's not a good concept, because the people smugglers will happily sacrifice 800.
Solutions are the right concept.
Regional solution is the way to go. Everybody's been working on it for 10 or 15 years, and it's part of the regional solution.
We have one in place and it works.
Pursuing that, well, not anymore. I mean, you know,
no, because they changed the legislation and they watered it down
compared to where a lot of these people have come from, and that's why you've got to look at it. And the 800 thing, I think, was just a minimal thing negotiated. You obviously have to lift that, but it's the only thing on the table at the moment which will stop people getting on boats. It's as simple as that. And until you put that sort of arrangement in place, people are going to die at sea.
But Chris Bowen hasn't been able to go back to Malaysia yet and come up with any more, in terms of security of people who we send back there. The Houston panel did say that a lot of work needed to be done on that. We haven't seen that from this government yet. We are running out of time, so I do want to bring up another issue, another backflip of sorts, I guess you'd say. We had another reminder of the unions and the factional leaders in the Labor Party this week when we saw that Don Farrell, a senator who most of our viewers probably have never heard of, was on the top spot of the South Australian Senate ticket. Penny Wong was placed number 2, of course, a key member of Labor's economic team. We saw later in the week Senator Farrell said, no, I'll stand back, let Penny Wong take the number 1 spot. But still, this is something that did remind everyone about the factions and how important that was. Peter, is this something we should have been concerned about, or is it just a misunderstanding of the way that both of the major parties work in terms of who they put on to their Senate tickets?
Absolutely. I think it was a storm in a teacup. I think Don Farrell did the right thing. He saw this was becoming a media issue. He said, you know, it's not that important. Penny should be number 1, and that was a good outcome. But I think that's exactly right. We actually need to, political parties have democratic processes in which they select people, and the Liberal Party the same in that state. Others have raised that Corey Bernardi's number 1 on the ticket. Now, I wouldn't pick Corey Bernardi, but you know what? I'm not a member of the South Australian Liberal Party, so I don't have a right to have a say, and I'm sure they're not very interested in my view. And similarly, and fair enough, you know, similarly, if we want to have democracy within political parties, you need to accept the outcomes.
But John, how can you have someone like Penny Wong? She seemed to be one of the top performers. She's a household name, always out there. Voters recognise her. Have her.
I've got a lot of time for Penny. I'm not so sure she's a household name, but anyway, I think the way to see this is very simple. Yeah, I think Peter's right. Don did the right thing by saying, look, you know, if this is becoming a big problem, I'm out of here.
Don had his arm twisted.
But arm twisted or not, whatever kind of reflection. Yeah. But look, I think the key thing
here is... It took him a couple of days to come to this decision.
But wait a second. But I think we also have to focus on the fact that, as Peter said, there's a process here. It was always incumbent on Penny, who would have known she wouldn't have won that ballot. It's a proportional representation ballot. people run on different tickets because she's in a faction too. She's in the left, and so she runs on a ticket against Don Farrell, and she comes second. So she gets second on the ticket. That's the way it works. If she'd picked up the phone and said, "Don, we can go into head office and sign an agreement where we both go on the same ticket," then that would have been all over.
I think that's the sad reality. Both parties.
Now I don't know what the background is, and I'm certainly not
politics. It's not merit.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're doing it on merit, clearly Penny Wong was way out in front, but that's the way the major parties now operate, just on where the numbers are.
Is it fair enough for Labor to throw back this Corey Bernardi issue?
No,
we saw that he was demoted from his parliamentary secretary position. He's #1 in South Australia. Someone like Simon Birmingham is below him, and some have argued this week, well, Simon should be up the list because Corey's been misbehaving.
Well, in government, the Liberal Party in government has always had the more senior people higher up on the ticket. Amanda Vanstone was ahead of Nick Minchin on the ticket when she was the senior minister, and when Nick rose up the ranks and became the senior minister to Amanda, he was on the head of the ticket. There were numbers over the years in South Australia to have removed Robert Hill from being the top of the Senate ticket, but he was the most senior one, so he was always the top of the ticket. Now, this idea that Don Farrell did the right thing, I mean, give me a break. He could have done the right thing before the ballot. Everyone knew this was an issue, but in a patronising move, decided he'd win it anyway.
How do you do the right thing and go around asking people to vote for somebody else? That's impossible.
It's not impossible. The factions control everything. You turn around and say, vote for Penny #1 and me #2. That's how I want it to be.
The Liberal Party,
and that's what had happened.
Like the Liberal Party problems we've got in New South Wales at the moment, it could have been managed more effectively internally if people had just been sensible.
I think it was terribly patronising to win the ballot when you could have changed the result of the ballot, but to win the ballot and then say, oh, but, you know, you're obviously upset, so here you go. I think it's terribly patronising to do it that way.
What else can you do if you nominate and you win the ballot?
Make sure the ballot goes the way you intended it to go, which was to put her #1.
So, no, but that's not how it works. You're contesting a ballot. You're obviously advocating that you want people to vote for you. That's how ballots work.
You're outcome-based. You got to the right outcome.
Peter, some of the coalition this week suggested that this was misogyny at play, that Penny Wong was down the list because she's #2. Is it strange how we're seeing everything through this new prism?
Well, absolutely, and clearly it wasn't. Clearly it was just factional numbers. And when David's talking about the Liberal Party in government, I mean, doing the right thing with actually putting senior people in the right spots, that had a lot to do with John Howard saying, get real people. This is the way you play it. And John Howard had an extraordinary influence on the Liberal Party for that entire era. The Liberal Party has moved on from that now and is probably close to the Labor Party in terms of this positioning of candidates. But I think with Penny Wong, I mean, the outcome was, I suppose it was going to take a little bit of heartburn to get there, but the outcome was always going to be the same. Eventually she would be the top of the ticket because merit would out in that case. She's so high profile.
We have seen also Julie Bishop this week seizing on the misogyny stuff. She said in the Parliament, as a woman, she was offended that Julia Gillard had suggested that Tony Abbott came up with her question. Does it surprise you? Do you think we've seen the coalition seizing on this a bit more, saying that it worked perhaps for Labor?
Of course, because they saw the government do it with the feigned indignance that the government used this and tried to basically label anyone who said anything as a misogynist or a sexist or a something. It was ridiculous when it started. It should end. The sooner both sides stop doing it, the better off we'll be, because it's frankly a load of rubbish. And no one out there in the electorate cares. They do not listen to any of this stuff and say, oh, he's a misogynist because he said that. I mean, it is just ridiculous. It is not playing out there in the community. It is not an issue that anyone is concerned about. It's an inside-the-beltware little thing to try and take some skin off your opponent every single time. And if you can't do it any other way, you call them a sexist or you call them some other name. This is just a case of hoping enough mud sticks, and we need to move on from it. I mean, this was supposed to be the new paradigm of raising the standard of debate in the Parliament, and I think the Prime Minister's speech a few weeks ago lowered it significantly.
Beautiful in its ugliness, something like that, Rob Oakeshott said after the 2010 election, and it's probably going to get uglier next year as we get into an election year. Thank you for your company. John Della Bosca, thank you for joining us, former New South Wales Labor Minister. Peter Bentley, head of the Labor-aligned McKell Institute. David Miles of Willard Consulting, and Peter Debnam, the former New South Wales Liberal leader. We appreciate your time this evening, and thank you for your time as well. We'll see you next time.
I'm Stephen Tapsell, a water study leader at Santos. Our search for coal seam gas is unlocking another significant resource, new supplies of water. This water we extract is salty, but once it's treated, it's ready for a range of uses. In Queensland, this water is already irrigating crops to feed cattle, and soon it will replenish town water supplies through aquifer re-injection. We know water is a critical issue, but CSG is not a threat to this essential commodity. Santos, as an Australian company and the largest, most experienced CSG exploration company in New South Wales, have the processes to protect our water.
Authorised by P. Mitchley, Sydney.
What's my city mantra? First, stay at a Mantra Hotel at the heart of things, where you can be comfortable in your surroundings. Enjoy the view. If you have to work, try and enjoy it, but make sure it's not all business. And remember what's important. That's why I stay at my City Mantra Hotel.
I've worked hard for what I've got.
I'd like to retire feeling safe
and secure.
We just want our investments
to look after the family tomorrow,
so we can focus on today.
If there are opportunities
to get my investments
back on track,
I want to know about it.
With the strength of Colonial First State behind you, wherever you stand on investing in super, we have options for you. Get advice on how Colonial First State can help you.
It's wonderful, it's marvelous, it's what I love to see. It's wonderful, it's marvelous, that you should care for me.
Yes, punters, welcome to the world of Sporting Bet.
At Sporting Bet, we live and breathe sports and racing. It's what we do, day in and day out. That's why we're the punter's favourite, providing top odds and unique promotions on a huge range of markets. And our cutting-edge technology means you can bet anywhere, anytime. So if you're into sports and racing as much as we are, go to sportingbet.com.au today, because there's no better bet than a Sporting Bet.
It's embedded in our lives, from rental cars to hotel chains, Legoland to TV land. Private equity, just who runs the world's biggest buyout shops and what are their character? On the record, this week, only on Sky News Business.
Live coverage. This is Sky News, Australia's news channel.
G'day, I'm Paul Murray. Thank you so much for watching. Welcome to the show, a show that doesn't just tell you what happened today, but hopefully by the end of it you'll know what really happened today. A great panel for you this evening, and we'll get to them very shortly, including from the Australian newspaper, and soon to join the Australian Women's Weekly. The lovely Carolyn Overington will join us, and I'm keen to know, who do you think is the winner and loser of the week? You can tell me using the hashtag of PM Live on Twitter. Email pmlive@skynews.com.au, and if you are anywhere near Facebook, just go searching for Paul Murray Live. There's a lot of politics to get to, and we'll get to that this evening, and there's plenty of fun to talk about from the United States that has absolutely nothing to do with the storms, and again our thoughts are with all of the people there this evening, and I do recommend that you go to the Red Cross's website in the United States. But first, we heard a plan today, a plan that will go nowhere, a plan that won't pass the Parliament, a plan that is only an idea. But the idea is to give everyone on the dole a pay rise, to give everyone on the dole a $50 a week pay rise. Now, the Greens and their Deputy Leader, Adam Bant, believe that this is needed because the distance between the unemployment benefit and an aged pension or a disability pension is too great, that an extra $50 a week would mean that those people who are on unemployment benefits would be able to feed and to house and to take care of their families. Now, in and of itself, I have no problem, and I honestly don't have any problem with a safety net being there in our community. It's part of the reasons why I'm more than happy to pay tax, and anyone who knows that you've got two jobs knows that you pay half of your wage in tax. What I'm not happy with, though, is the idea that because there's some distance between the handout that is given by the government and the cost of everything, that rather than going off and finding employment that might perhaps be able to fill the gap or replace the welfare payment, instead we adjust the welfare payment to match the lifestyle that one is not living. Now, I'm not suggesting that people who are on unemployment benefits are living in mansions beside the harbour or putting their feet up at St Kilda Beach each and every day. Clearly that's not the case. No doubt there are an awful lot of people who are legitimately unemployed, and there is no doubt in the world there are plenty of people who just can't find a job. But we all know that there are plenty of people as well who just can't find the right job or can't find the job that they want. So if we are going to have a conversation about welfare and welfare entitlements, fine. Let's raise it by $100 a week. But let's do a trade-off. You can't have it 52 weeks a year. Why can't unemployment benefits be used as a stopgap measure between jobs? Why can't we have a system that might be a little bit too harsh at the first look, but once you start thinking about it, it might actually work? Why not a system where you can only claim up to 6 months' worth of unemployment benefits every 2 years? Meaning if you don't get money from the government, you've got to go and get it from somewhere else. And that might be a job you don't want to do, but it's a job nonetheless. There are very few people who get up each and every day and go to their dream job. I'm lucky enough, I'm able to do it. And I didn't do it because I inherited the job, and I didn't do it because I knew somebody who gave me the gig. Now, admittedly, you mightn't get your dream job, but there surely is something out there other than just ticking off the book and not really putting effort into actually finding a job. Can you know what you think? The hashtag PMLive, email pmlive@skynews.com.au. It might seem hard-hearted, but that's because I work 12 hours a day and I'm a bit tired of hearing that other people just deserve an extra $50 because times are a little bit tough for them. Keen to know what you think. Hashtag PMLive, email pmlive@skynews.com.au. Sharon McKenzie, nice to have you back. What do we need to know about this evening?
Well, let's have a look at our newest VC recipient in Australia, certainly saluting a new hero, Corporal Daniel Kieran, our 99th soldier, awarded the Victoria Cross Medal for bravery. He risked his life in Afghanistan by drawing enemy fire to himself and away from his fellow troops engaged in a rescue mission.
Corporal Daniel Kieran truly is a humble hero. The 29-year-old only told his wife about the heroics which led to today's honour when he was informed about it 2 weeks ago.
Let me just say she wasn't impressed to start with.
She can only be impressed now hearing her husband's story. Heavily outnumbered during this battle in August 2010, he repeatedly exposed himself to enemy fire, helping to identify the insurgents' location and allow a wounded mate to get treatment.
I wouldn't be here today if I wasn't for the boys with me that day.
One of those boys isn't here today though, Jared McKinney, killed in action.
James guy's got a gunshot wound. He was one of my good mates.